My name is Jessica Finzen. I'm a professor of mathematics at the University of Bonn, and I just joined this month the scientific committee, which I'm very happy about. I'm really happy to see all of you here and hope you have a wonderful event. We continue the scientific program today. We will start with a Spark session. So we will have 4 short Spark talks. It's the same procedure as on Tuesday. And as on Tuesday, the Spark session is moderated by Tom Crawford from the University of Oxford, who, as we already learned, loves to share his love for mathematics. It's my pleasure to welcome him to the stage. Tom Crawford.
Good morning again. So it was pointed out to me after the session on Tuesday that if you tell our laureates that they have between 15 and 20 minutes to do a Sparks talk, it will be 22 minutes long, which was, of course, why we overran a little bit. But today, we have 4 speakers, and in theory, a 90-minute session, which, if everyone keeps to the same timing, would give us probably time for a single question. So hopefully, we will at least get a single question in the sessions today. So first up, we have Martin Hellman, who received the Turing Award in 2015 for his work in public key cryptography. And his career since has seen him do many things, and these are some of the highlights that really stood out to me. He first evaded the NSA. He then campaigned to defuse the nuclear threat, and has recently written a book on relationships co-authored with his wife. And now today, he is here to discuss the existential threats of AI. Martin.
Thank you, Tom. And since you mentioned the book, I'll tell people if they want to get a free copy, we've made it freely available as a PDF. Just go to my Stanford homepage and look at the top. You'll see in big letters, get a free copy of his new book, except it's 7 years old and I haven't changed that. So let's see. Yeah. There we go. I'm starting a stopwatch, so I stick to the 20 minutes. This talk will address the following 3 questions. 1, how serious a threat does AI pose to civilization? It turns out there's uncertainty there. 2, how does that risk compare to other threats? It turns out we're neglecting some that are even greater right now. What changes are needed in the international environment to reduce the risk? So I'll start with the AI risks letter that many of you, in fact, probably all of you know about, that came out, I think, last May. It was, the lead signer is Geoffrey Hinton. So here we have a Turing Laureate and one of his co-authors, but not the other, Yoshua Bengio, signed it. And what it says, it's very short. I signed it too. And it says, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks, such as pandemics and nuclear war. Now, I'm not an expert in AI, but I am an expert in nuclear risk, and I have experienced the pandemic, in case you haven't heard about it. And so I was happy to sign. But then a month later, June 10th, I think it was, I'm at the ACM Awards banquet, and I'm sitting next to my good friend and colleague, Ed Feigenbaum, who won the Turing Award with Raj Reddy in 1994 for their work on AI. And Ed was surprised that I had signed this letter. And so I sent him an email. We had a conversation, but I sent him an email to make sure I got it right. And here's what Ed said. He discounts the fears that AI might become an existential threat. He sees little evidence to justify the use of the scary E word, meaning an existential threat. In other words, it could be a threat. It could kill people, but it's not going to threaten civilization. AI's growing pains, and he put that in quotes, are being extrapolated to the borders of science fiction without sufficient evidence of societal harm, end of quote. I'm not saying I agree with that, but that's what one Turing Award winner said. Well, I was fortunate here that Raj Reddy, his cohort in crime, was here, and I asked Raj, and he said, oh, he absolutely agrees, so correct me if I'm wrong, Raj, if you're here, but I'm pretty sure, and I said, can I quote you on that? And he said, yes. And then yesterday on the boat ride, Adi Shamir, who's sitting in the front row and spoke, I think 2 days ago, also said, look, it is a risk. He doesn't doubt that people will die from artificial intelligence, but again, correct me if I got it wrong, Adi, you said existential risk, no way. And he's nodding his head. So there is, the conclusion is there's uncertainty. We have experts on one side saying it's a huge risk, experts on the other side saying existential risk is crazy. Where should we be? Well, I'm going to quote something that I said in 2019 when I gave the Heidelberg lecture at Lindau, and then I gave the same talk here. And I was talking about climate change, but the same applies to AI. Are the risks so low, the cost so high, and the uncertainty so great that our current efforts to combat climate change are adequate? And so that was a question. And I would say the same about AI. Of course, the cost to not going forward with AI is much higher. It's hard to say that. Certainly fossil fuels have done a lot of good. So there's uncertainty there. But how much uncertainty do you need before you say, I need to do something, or I need to be thinking about this at a minimum? And so I think we need to be thinking about it at a minimum. So let me turn to the second question, which is how does the risk of artificial intelligence compared to other threats that we're facing? And here I get to talk about my favorite topic, the risk of a nuclear war. And people might say, why is this my favorite topic? I mean, am I some kind of ghoulish person? Well, I see the nuclear threat as, first of all, the paramount risk to society right now, the paramount existential risk. Although, again, I'll tell you in a little bit about my conversation with Adi yesterday on the boat. And let's see. I've estimated 2.5 years ago, I had companion papers with Vince Cerf. I argued for a quantitative estimate of the risk of, the reason it's my favorite topic is the nuclear threat is also the nuclear opportunity. If we would recognize that the level of threat, then we would have to build a world that is much more cooperative, because you cannot deal with nuclear weapons. And actually, I'll say toward the end, you can't deal with artificial intelligence. You can't deal with global warming in the current world where nations are trying to kill one another. And so we need to build a more cooperative world. It's essential. And this was the topic of my talk 4 years ago at the 2019 HLF and at Lindau. The title of the talk, and again, it's on my publications page, so if you want to watch the Lindau version, because that's the one that I have a link to, go to my homepage, and at the top right next to the free PDF big link, you'll see in big text publications. Go there and scroll down to 2019, which will take a while, but get there and look for the either written version or the video version of my talk at Lindau. And you'll see why the nuclear threat and these other threats are also opportunities. We've always dreamed of building a world that's more cooperative, and we've always found ourselves unable to do it. In the nuclear age, in the age of pandemics, in the age of artificial intelligence, in the age of climate change, we will either do that or we will not survive. And so I am trying to help us grow up. The analogy that I used in that talk is that humanity is like a 16-year-old kid with a new driver's license who somehow gets his hands on a 500 horsepower Ferrari. And either we're going to grow up really fast or we're going to kill ourselves. And I'm working, and all of you here at HLF are working, because we have people from different countries, some countries not so friendly with one another, and yet here we can all be friends. Why is that? I was born in October 1945. The war had just ended in the Pacific. My father was not home yet. He was in the South Pacific. I had no uncles in the European theater. But nice Germans and nice Americans who had been trying to kill each other just months before. Why can we be friends today and enemies then? Why the same, my neighbor across the street is Japanese. We're friends. My father and my uncles were trying to, and his grandparents might have been trying to kill one another. What is the difference? Why do we need to do this? And can we survive if we continue to do it? So let me go over quickly why I think the risk of a nuclear war is so great. And this applies then to other areas as well, but this is the one I've studied the most. And I should emphasize, and I will tell you that not everyone agrees with me, but Vint and I had companion papers in which Vint argued for a qualitative estimate or a qualitative approach to the idea, and he still saw the risk as unacceptable. Correct me if I'm wrong. No, he agrees. And I argued for a quantitative estimate, not because I think most people relate to numbers. People here do at HLF, but the average person, you say 1% per year and his eyes or her eyes glaze over and they stop paying attention. So I think we need qualitative arguments, but we also need quantitative arguments to back up why the qualitative arguments are needed. And I've refined, Bill Perry, who is a former US Secretary of Defense and has a PhD in mathematics, so he understands numbers as well as national security. In June 2021, so just 3 months after Vint and I published our companion pieces, Bill told me that he agreed with my 1% per year estimate to an order of magnitude. And I asked Bill if I could quote him on that, and he said yes. So again, we may be wrong, Adi may be right, but still it warrants looking at. So how do I come up with 1% a year? I ruled out, first of all, I said that we cannot estimate the risk of a major nuclear war, and I should emphasize major nuclear war, an existential nuclear war, one that would destroy civilization. Because Adi thinks that we will might have small nuclear wars, in fact, maybe probably will, but they will stay purely military. And correct me if I get you wrong on any of this, but he's nodding his head so far. I ruled out 10% a year, because if the risk were 10% a year, and by the way, this is a time-invariant model, but the models only need to be accurate to an order of magnitude as well if we're only going for an order of magnitude estimate in the risk. 10% a year is clearly too much because over the last 60 or 70 years, we would have expected 6 or 7 nuclear wars, and major nuclear wars, and we've had none. We haven't had the use of any nuclear weapons. And on this, Adi, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but you agreed 10% per year is too much. I then skipped over 1% per year, which is my estimate, to an order of magnitude lower, and this is where Adi and I disagreed. I ruled out 0.1% per year, but Bill Perry, by the way, agrees with me, so there's unfortunately, or maybe there's room for argument here. I ruled out 0.1% per year as follows. Even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which may be comparable to the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of the level of risk of using a single nuclear weapon and maybe even escalating to full-scale nuclear war, even before that, we had one major crisis in the last 60 years. What was it? The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So to first order, we'd have to expect if nuclear deterrence as now practiced, which is an important caveat, if nuclear deterrence as now practiced could work for 1,000 years before it failed, we would expect 10 to 20 such crises over the next 1,000 years. And having studied the Cuban Missile Crisis, I am convinced that we were lucky to make it through one without an existential nuclear war, without a major nuclear war. And here's where Adi disagrees with me. This is okay. I am convinced that we were lucky to make it through one, and thinking that we could make it through 10 or 20 or maybe 30 or 40, because now if you say the Ukraine war we've had 2 major crises in the last 60 years, you'd have to double it. And so that's where I end up saying that 0.1% per year is too small, 10% per year is too large. What's the only order of magnitude in between 1% per year? It doesn't mean it's exactly that level. It could be 2 or 3%, it could be 0.5 or 1/3%, but it's not the others. Now here's where Adi, and not only Adi, but many people disagree with me, and I'm having to think about what he said. Adi argued that, yes, there will be the use of nuclear weapons in incidents like that. And I'll tell you 3 examples, because none of you were born when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, the young researchers. And actually I was talking to some who even didn't know what it was, which it shocked me at first until I thought, do I know about all the crises in the 1890s? No. So I'll give you just 3 data points during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are many others, but these are the 3 biggest ones. We did not learn until 40 years after the crisis, in 2002, that the 3 Soviet submarines that were attacked by American destroyers carried nuclear torpedoes. And in at least one case, the crew maintains that the captain came close to using the nuclear torpedo. What would have happened if the American fleet had been vaporized by a nuclear torpedo? Fortunately, he was talked down, he surfaced, and actually got in trouble when he got back to the Soviet Union for surfacing. He knew he would die if he used the nuclear torpedo, but he said, at least we'll take them down with us, according to the crew member. And I should mention a few additional points. The air conditioning on the Soviet submarine was designed for the Arctic, not surprisingly. Where was the submarine? In the Caribbean, 80-degree Fahrenheit, what is that? Roughly 30 degrees centigrade, I think, water. The air conditioning was not working. The temperature had gotten up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, 55 degrees Celsius. The submarines were not designed to stay underwater for long periods of time, and sailors were fainting from lack of oxygen. So you can begin to see where this is not just a simple problem. The second example that I'll mention is that all of the American military, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, wanted to invade Cuba even after Kennedy diffused the crisis with Khrushchev. They did not stop to think, and we only learned 25 years later, that the Soviets had battlefield nuclear weapons on Cuba to repel just such an invasion. So if 250,000 American Marines had gone ashore in Cuba, they probably would have been vaporized. And again, I discussed this with Adi, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you said, yes, that would be horrible, and America would have retaliated, but not in a way that would have brought about World War III. We would have retaliated, in your opinion, in a way that would only have hit a military target with very little or no civilian collateral damage, and he's nodding his head. So we differ here, and this is something I'm going to look into when I get home, but I didn't have time between the boat ride yesterday and today to look into it yet. Oh, and I won't go into, there's another one. An American U-2 strayed into Soviet airspace. It got lost and went hundreds of kilometers into Soviet airspace. MiGs were scrambled to force it down. American F-102s from Alaska were sent up to escort it home. And because of the heightened tensions, the air-to-air missiles on the F-102s were nuclear armed. Now, Adi questioned whether we had miniaturized nuclear weapons, and I'm going to check, but I'm 99% confident that they were Falcon nuclear air-to-air missiles. But when I get home, I will double check it. But even then, even if, fortunately, by the way, the MiGs never got to Maltby or the nuclear armed F-102s, and so we didn't have this problem. But even if they had, Adi believes, and again, correct me if I get it wrong, that even if the F-102s had used their nuclear air-to-air missiles against the MiGs, this would have been out over Siberia, and it would have ended in a way where there might have been many deaths, horrible war, but not a civilization-destroying war, and again, he's nodding his head. So again, we differ on this, and it's hard to say who's right, and I'll leave it up to you to do your own thinking about it, and I'm going to do some more research when I get home, because Adi gave me some really good things to think about. Well, let me conclude by asking, if one wants to rein in these threats, if one agrees even that the threats either are existential, or even if they're not existential, that they're great enough that we need to rein them in, how can we do that? It seems impossible in the current environment. In the book my wife and I wrote, we have a section called "Inconceivable Does Not Mean Impossible." And this is important because it was inconceivable to me that my wife and I might have a marriage. We've been married 56 years now. We haven't had a fight in roughly 20 years. I grew up in a Woody Allen movie, if you know what it is. I grew up in the New York Jewish culture. People fought all the time. This was the norm. And this was inconceivable to me. I made the mistake of saying it was impossible. I now know it was possible. And by the way, we still disagree, and we learn from our disagreements rather than fighting over them. And I believe, I'm convinced, the same is possible at an international level. But if we want to rein in these threats, we need much greater international cooperation. And of course, I'm a professor, so you say, what does he know about national security? Well, we have a statement which basically says that in this age of nuclear weapons, pandemics, cyber attacks, today we would add artificial intelligence, global environmental crises like climate change, national security is becoming an obsolete concept. It's not yet an obsolete concept, but it is becoming an obsolete concept if we do not think of national security as an integral part of the global security of all nations. Well, that's a wonderful statement, but how realistic is that? Well, former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta signed the statement. Bobby Inman signed that statement, and those of you who were at my lightning talk will know who he is. Admiral Bobby Inman. So in my conviction, we need to create global security for all nations to have national security. The two are becoming inseparable. How can we have any control over the negative consequences of AI, to come back to AI, when nations are building it into weapon systems? And the same is true for nuclear weapons and climate change. Really, the title of my talk in 2019 was The Technological Imperative for Ethical Evolution. Technology is forcing us to become more ethical, to have more meetings like HLF where people from different countries can come together and be friends. So national security is becoming inseparable from global security, I am convinced, and we neglect that truth at our peril. Thank you, and I'm at 19 minutes according to my watch.
Okay, our second talk of this morning's session comes from Daniel Spielman, who received the Nevanlinna Prize in 2010, which has now changed its name to the Abacus Medal. And this was for, amongst many things, his work on applications of graph theory to numerical computing. When I was searching the name change regarding the prize yesterday, I discovered that when you type in Nevanlinna Prize into Google, it is Daniel's image is the first one that appears. So I don't know whether you're aware that you are now the poster person for this particular medal. It's you holding your medal up to the camera. And I actually recorded an interview with Daniel yesterday, which will be on YouTube, where, first of all, he admitted to preferring spaces over tabs when he's programming. And he did also told me that the work he'll be talking about today is 4 years in the making and potentially new developments to come soon. But I will leave it to him to obviously elaborate on that. So his talk is on improving the design of randomized controlled trials. Daniel.
Thank you. To try to fulfill some of Martin's optimism, I'd like to tell you how mathematics and computer science can come together to help improve the design of randomized controlled trials. To the extent there's a paper related to what I'm going to talk about, it's this one, which is joint with Christopher Harshaw, who's now a postdoc at MIT, Frederick Savy, who's a professor in political science at Yale, and Peng Zhang, who's now a professor in computer science at Rutgers. And the Gram-Schmidt walk is not our algorithm. It comes from this amazing paper by Bansal, Dadouche, Garg, and Lovett. The best way for me to get into this topic is to tell you how I got into it and what my motivation was. So one day, my colleague, Nicholas Christakis, shown here, came by my office because he had a problem. He was working on designing a trial of interventions to improve maternal health outcomes, to improve the health of pregnant women and their newborns. And they're doing things like trying to get people to start taking prenatal vitamins. They were testing these interventions, or as we'll call them, treatments, in rural villages in Honduras. They had 176 villages. Okay, that means this is a huge study. And I've drawn them roughly in latitude and longitude here. They were trying 16 different interventions. That meant they had to divide these 176 villages into 16 groups, each of only 11 villages. And I've tried to indicate them here by color. Each color corresponds to one treatment. They were looking at a type of random assignment, and they ran into what we call the law of small numbers. When you choose a few things at random, you see patterns. So for example, here are just the red villages in that assignment. You'll see that they're all roughly in the western end of this region. And then he was concerned if that group of villages, the villages getting that treatment, does particularly well or particularly poorly, he wouldn't know. Is it because of the treatment or something going on the western end of the country? And by the way, they're not always this bad, but usually you'll find examples like this with one or two exceptions. Here are the ones that were in brown, all in a middle latitude, same problem. I mean, it's not just his worry. Referees are going to complain. Other people are going to complain when they're doing meta-analyses. And the problem was more involved than this. As you can imagine, for a study of this magnitude, they knew a lot about the villages in the study. And they'd measured many things about them. I learned they call them covariates. So I learned covariates are the things we measure about the subjects of the study. They knew things about altitude, distance to hospitals, how often it rained, how long it took to get to the hospital when it's raining, which varies a lot. Median income, average age, all sorts of social and economic measures of these villages. And they wanted to balance all of them. And I said, you know what? I can help you, because I know discrepancy theory. And the main lesson of discrepancy theory is that if you have a bunch of things, you can divide them into groups that are very similar to each other. How similar? Well, our basic benchmark is more similar than if you did it at random. So I figured we've got to be able to help. So let me tell you about some of the classic results in discrepancy theory. First, to introduce, let me just give you an example that comes from Spencer's work. Let's say I have 8 people. I called them P1 through P8. And now I've measured some covariates about them. Whether or not they're a mathematician or a computer scientist. I'll put a 1 if they are and 0 otherwise. People can be both. Whether or not they're a student. I'm imagining this audience. And then let's say what editors do they use when they're writing LaTeX? Some people still use Vim. So I'd like to divide these into 2 groups that are similar. So I've added a column to say whether we're going to put people in group A or group B. For the rest of this talk, let's just talk about 2 groups. It's much simpler to think about. And I've shaded those that are in group B. And now I want a small difference between these 2 groups. So to measure that, let's add 2 more rows. One that gives us the sum of the totals in group A and one with the sum of the totals in group B, and 1 more row that gives us the difference. And here, the extreme outlier, the column with the most difference, is the column for students, and the difference is -2, because group A had 1 student and group B had 3 students. We would like to minimize the maximum of those differences. And what Joel Spencer told us is you can at least do this much better than if you were doing it at random. So let's put some numbers on that. Imagine we had n people and d covariates. And think of d as being less than n for now. If you do this at random and we want the maximum absolute value of this difference, so it's the infinity norm of the difference vector, it'll be about root d log n. So root d is reasonable, log n grows with n, it's sort of unappealing. That's what happens at random. Joel Spencer pointed out in 1985 in this amazing paper called 6 Standard Deviations Suffice that you can actually get a difference at most 6 times root d. And 6 doesn't grow with n. Okay, now some of you are thinking, when is 6 more or less than root log n? You'll realize n has to be pretty big before 6 is a win. But you know what, 6 doesn't have to be 6 if n is small. It can be smaller. This is just the asymptotics. Anyway, the key thing here is Joel Spencer told us we could do much better than at random, but this was only a theorem. It didn't come with an algorithm. It was an existence result. And for a long time, people thought we'd never have an algorithm that does this efficiently. Until in 2010, Nikhil Bansal came up with a polynomial time algorithm for doing this. Okay, it didn't quite get the constant 6, but it was a polynomial time algorithm. And this set off really a huge explosion of work in discrepancy theory. I mean, there had been many other theorems in discrepancy theory, and after Bansal's work, people started coming up with algorithms that realized them too. But it also taught us a lot more about discrepancy theory and gave us new techniques for proving theorems in discrepancy theory. So this is algorithmic advance also advanced the mathematics of discrepancy. To tell you more, I want to give you a geometric perspective on this. So imagine our people are now vectors. I'll call them V1 through Vn. And you know what? Our quantities don't have to be discrete. They can be real numbers, let's say between -1 and 1. So now we have n d-dimensional vectors. I've drawn a bunch here. And to divide them into groups, I want to make this arithmetic too. So I'll describe a vector z that takes plus or minus 1 values. So say +1 for one group, -1 for another group. And what we want is we want the two groups to be similar. So I want the sum of the vectors in one group, those for which zi is equal to 1, to be similar to the sum of the vectors in the group for which it's -1. Here's a division of these points into orange and purple points that achieves that. Now, of course, if I say those two quantities are similar, that means that their difference should be small, and that's a better way of saying it. So really, I want the sum over I of my number zi plus or minus 1 times the vectors to have small norm. Okay, in the previous slide, I suggested using the infinity norm, but you can look at other norms as well, and interesting things happen when you do. Now, of course, when I write this, some of you are going to say, what if I'm looking at the sum, why not look at the means? And if the groups are the same size, it's equivalent to say that the means of the two groups are similar. I drew the means of the groups with stars here, a yellow star and a purple star, and a red arrow gives you the difference. We'd like that difference to be small. Okay, but are similar means enough? Well, here's 8 points I've given you. And here's a division of them into two groups where the means are very similar. And I see my PDF did something weird. That should be a circle in the lower right. Same color. Well, this has the same problem that bugged Nicholas initially. While my means are similar, the orange points are almost collinear and the purple points are almost collinear. And if I rotated this by 45 degrees, you'd say, you know, one is in the middle of the country. So you can look at more than means. You can look at second moments. That corresponds to a moment ellipse. And it turns out that you can always divide sets of points in two so that the moment ellipses are much more similar than they would have been at random. This is a consequence of the resolution of the Cadison-Singer problem that I did with Marcus and Srivastava, and the formulation of it in terms of moment ellipses was due to Weaver. So we know this always exists. By the way, it is still very open how to make an algorithm for this. We have no idea if there's an efficient way. There's a lot we don't know. We don't even know if you can simultaneously balance the second moments and the first moments. You'd think you can balance the first moments and balance second moments. You can do both. We don't know. There are a lot of open problems here. Sometimes we barely understand this second moment phenomenon. But it turns out this is still not actually sufficient for solving the problem that Nicholas cared about. And the reason is you need randomization. At the end of the day, we want to make statistical statements about how confident we should be in our results. We need p-values. We need confidence intervals. And you can't get any of that unless you're doing something at random. So what we really want is not just one division of subjects into groups. We want a distribution of divisions of subjects into groups. And for the rest of today, what we're really going to care about is the inner product of this difference that I made between the two groups, the sum of the zi's, vi's, that red vector, with some unknown vector mu. I will tell you what it is, but for now, we don't know it because it's sort of hidden to us. It's why we're doing the experiment. So here's an example of such a distribution. I drew that unknown vector mu, and I gave you some different partitions of these points into two groups, and in each case, I draw the mean. And one thing you see is that one way to make the inner product of the difference of mu small is to make the mean vectors of the difference. I mean, the difference in mean small. But an even easier way is to choose it at random so that it's small on average, and you can do much better that way. So randomization can be much better than anything you're going to do deterministically. Okay, thankfully, there's this algorithm called the Gram-Schmidt walk, which does this. So while discrepancy problems usually look like deterministic problems, Bonsall, Gardner, Dush, and Lovett, they came up with a randomized algorithm because they were trying to come up with an algorithm for realizing Banachik's theorem, which was a theorem in discrepancy theory about sort of arbitrary norms or arbitrary balls. And they solved it by sampling from a distribution on these divisions. So they really produce a distribution on Z. And we turned that into this thing we call the Gram-Schmidt-Walk design. And I just want to tell you first the summary of what it produces. Because saying, like making referees happy is not really our end goal. Our end goal is statistical. So our end goal is to get better estimates of treatment effects. That is what you can get, at least when the covariates you've measured are informative. If the covariates are random noise, they provide nothing. But if the covariates are informative, then this sort of discrepancy theoretic approach gets you better estimates of your treatment effects. And you can get strong worst case guarantees. Okay, now let me formalize this a little bit, because that's actually what a lot of our paper is doing. We work under what's called the potential outcomes model of Nyman and Rubin. And this assumes that for each subject, there are two unknown quantities. Little a of I, which is what that subject's outcome will be if they are in group capital A. And little b of I, which is that subject's outcome if they're in group capital B. But you never see both of these. You can see little a of I or little b of I. So you can give someone the vaccine and you can give them the placebo, but you can't do both simultaneously. That's what makes experiments so hard. And in the Nyman-Rubin model, we assume that our only source of randomness is the assignment to groups A or B. We're not going to try to exploit randomness in outcomes or anything like that. So it's a very conservative model. When we talk about experimental design, we are actually talking about the distribution of our division of these subjects into two groups. So the standard default design, I'll call the uniform one. For each subject, you just flip a coin. It comes up heads, you put them in group A, tails in group B. Now, a lot of us have some intuition that you actually don't want to quite do that. Maybe you want the two groups to be the same size. I'm going to suggest you should mathematically justify that intuition, and we can think about why it's true. So probably you want a balanced design, maybe, each group to be of size a half. The most common other design I'll just mention, and you can ask about it later, is matching designs. In matching designs, you take your subjects, you try to group them into pairs that are similar. And then for each pair, you flip a coin. And if it comes up heads, you put one person in group A, one in group B, tails the other way around. You do that independently for each pair. That's a common thing people use. What I'd like to talk about is estimating what we call average treatment effect. We denote this by tau. That is literally the average over subjects of the difference of putting them in group A minus group B. And I say this is what you want to estimate, and the difficulty is you have a sum, and you can never know any term in the sum. We estimate it by using what's called a Horvitz-Thompson estimator. It's got a little hat on it, which is basically appropriately scaled the sum of the things you observe, those in group A, minus the sum of the items you observe in group B. And this at least has the advantage that it is right in expectation. In expectation, the Horvitz-Thompson estimator is correct. But then you want to ask yourself, well, what's the error? That's what this is all about. So first we can actually write a formula for the error. It's up to 1 and n. It's the inner product of z, that plus minus 1 vector telling you the groups, with a vector I call mu, which is a plus b. So you actually add the potential outcomes from group A with the potential outcomes from group B. You make a big vector. You take its inner product with z, and we want that to be small. Okay, let's look at the mean squared error of that. That's the expectation of the squared inner product of z with mu. And we should benchmark by beginning with the independent coin flips for each subject. I'll call it the uniform random z. If you do that, the mean squared error is 1 and n squared times the squared Euclidean norm of mu. And you know what? In the worst case, this is the best you can do. If you have any other design, there are some potential outcomes on which your error will be at least this large in mean square. So why am I talking about any of this? It's because if you're lucky and your covariates are informative or you know something useful, then you can do better. If you're lucky, balancing group sizes is better. But it doesn't have to be. So here's what the Gram-Schmidt-Walk does. This is my last slide. It's determined by a parameter, phi, between 0 and 1. Let's think of it being near 1. We will get a better mean squared error when mu, okay, let's focus on that term involving mu up there. There's a mu minus VB. V is the taking all the covariate vectors and put them into a big matrix. And basically we're saying, what is the best linear fit of mu in terms of the covariate vectors? That's what beta V is giving you when you put the minimum out front. We're going to get something depending on that. Okay, the first sanity check here is that norm squared, that'll be smaller than the norm of mu. And if phi is near 1, then 1 over phi times that. It can't be too much more than mu squared. Okay, so we can't be much worse than the worst case. But when the covariates are predictive, we can be much better. So you have to give up a little bit in the worst case to be better when you've made a good choice of covariates. And we also analyze things like what's the right choice of phi and under reasonable situations and regularity assumptions, if n is big, yeah, you do want phi nearer than 1, which is pretty nice. Okay, for those who know machine learning or statistics, this is a ridge regression, or it's called regularized linear least squares, where the regularizer is the norm of beta. Except here's what's crazy. You never, ever have to compute this ridge regression. This is just analysis. This is an artifact of the design. And you couldn't compute it because the vector mu appears in there, and we don't know the vector mu because it's the sum of these two potential outcomes. So there's a regression that is implicit in our choice of design that's done without ever doing a regression. And that's nice because regression makes me nervous because sometimes you're actually fitting to noise, and using sort of regression adjustment or even fancier machine learning techniques can make your estimates much worse. If you're in the big N world, you might not worry about that. In the small N world, it's a real problem. Okay, so if you want to find out more, you can find the paper on my webpage. It's not hard. I don't write many papers. And if you look at it, you will find frameworks, algorithms, analysis of algorithms, statistics, confidence intervals, p-values, estimators, and so on. Thank you.
Slightly inside the 20, so I'm going to seize this opportunity to do the one question that I promised the audience we might be able to do. So does anyone have a hopefully short question for Daniel that we can squeeze in?
Yes, Adi, please.
The problem is that you don't know what are the covariates. You might, the real reason for the difference might be the amount of pollen in the air, or whether there's an oil refinery in the neighborhood. There are infinitely many possible covariates, and your analysis assumes that you know them. What would you do with unknown covariates?
That's a good question. The question is, what would you do with unknown covariates? And there's nothing I can do. You have to make choices about what to measure. You have to hope that you measure well. And at least we can promise you that if you make good measurements, you get better estimates. And if you think you have no idea what are reasonable covariates, then I'd go back to independent random coin flips.
Daniel, thank you very much. Our third speaker this morning is Leslie Valiant, who is a double award recipient with the Nevanlinna Prize in 1986 and the Turing Award in 2010. As I've been doing with all of our other speakers, I did try to provide a single one-sentence summary, but the list of achievements was far too long. I did enjoy researching that Leslie is a fellow Brit. I think there are some of us here, but it's always nice to see fellow Brits here. And we did both attend the University of Cambridge. I was Queen's College, Leslie was King's. I don't know if that immediately makes us rivals, but anyway. Today, Leslie will be talking about computer science for understanding ourselves. Leslie.
Thank you. So between us, we know about many reasons for studying mathematics and computer science, but the topic I'll deal with today, as the title suggests, is if we want to understand ourselves, an area where we usually go to the humanities. So here, there's a, okay, again, there's a, book in the background, and what I've shown you is part of the book, which I didn't do, but cover designer has. So, Okay. So what's at the bottom? So at the bottom, it's not the cursor on my computer. It's a picture of a cursor. And at the top is a picture of a Stone Age arrow. And so the question which I'm looking at today is how come, or how did humans go from the first to the second? And I want to identify a capability, a cognitive capability, which humans have, which enabled us to do this, and which other animals apparently are not able to do. And just for the setting, so we're not looking at any biological change. So certainly there have been many advances in human culture in the last 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, in the course of which we don't believe there's been significant evolution which swept through the human population. And in fact, if you look even further, so the human species is usually dated to about 300,000 years ago, and people have looked for mutations. So is there a single mutation which swept through the population and maybe made us smart? And these efforts have failed. So it's quite possible that for the last 300,000 years, there hasn't been any spectacular biological change of the nature of a mutation which swept through the whole population. Many other things could have happened, but not that, as far as we know. So this question has been looked at for a long time. So what makes humans unique? Many have asked it. In fact, you can go to a web page where there are 617 different answers. So these are topics studied by academics, which distinguish humans from the great apes. So there are all kinds of different things, but I'm looking at a capability which enables us to develop computers and go to the moon. So certainly, so eyebrows, for example, are apparently unique to humans, but probably having eyebrows, it doesn't explain how we get our civilization. There are many other things which are important in history. So animal domestication, very important, probably inevitable for human civilization. But again, there's no way of explaining how, if you can domesticate animals, you can invent this or that. And there are numerous other things like brain lateralization. We use our brains slightly more flexibly than other species, but again, it's not clear why that's enough. Learning, is that enough? Almost all of the animal kingdom can learn. So then there's some more sophisticated suggestions, so symbols, language. So again, this seems to be going in the right direction. But again, if you teach apes language, which you can to some extent, there's no evidence that eventually they'll make machines to go to the moon. So it's just not enough. It may be a consequence of what we are, but it's by itself, it's not enough. And of the many people who study this subject today, there are many books coming out, and these emphasize various aspects of humans. Some is social learning, that we learn from each other more than other animals do. We collaborate. So with all these things, there's also the question of whether it's unique to humans, but then the real question is, I want to ask is, you want an explanation of why we can build the civilization we have. So this is what I want to do. So this topic is clearly related to AI, but it's not exactly the same. So the Turing test is something very different, because Turing argued that, if the behavior is indistinguishable from a human, then you should accept that he's thinking or intelligent. But again, I'm looking for some more constructive description of the behavior which makes us what we are. So we want something explicitly defined. Okay, and so we will look to computer science for an answer to this. And by computer science, I mean somewhere where you define functionally what the operation, the capability you claim has. So if you exercise the capability, what difference does it make in the state of the world or your state? And also that you shouldn't ascribe functionality which is computationally infeasible. So this is roughly the constraints. So what to include in this capability? Well, we can look back in history. So Aristotle said that all belief comes from syllogism or induction. And in modern terms, syllogism would be called reasoning, and induction is machine learning. Now, these are both very important topics, but even here, there are no cast iron arguments about what's essential and what's not. And one way of saying it is that, in fact, you can find respectable people who deny either of those. So, for example, 30 or 40 years ago, inductive learning was denied by some people. There were deniers. People thought that cognition was based entirely on logical mechanisms. So, for example, Alan Newell wrote a book on cognition where it's very hard to find any evidence of any kind of inductive learning. On the other hand, now with all the successes of machine learning, there are many reasoning deniers. So some people think that just by having a big box for learning from billions of sentences, reasoning will become redundant. So the question of what exactly you should include as fundamental part to human cognition isn't a trivial question and has to be carefully argued. And so, but just to illustrate why I'm interested in these various aspects of AI, so just an example, so I've worked a lot on inductive learning, and in my work, the emphasis was on having a concrete model, the SPAC model. But what's interesting here is what exactly it formalizes, and what it formalizes is efficient generalization. So if you get many examples of something, can you generalize to new examples in your categorization? And in computer science, we do in these definitions, is a mathematical definition where you have some concrete expectations. And one expectation of this model of learning is that as you put more effort, that's on the horizontal axis, into your learning, you expect to be able to predict better and better. And furthermore, the better and better should be fast enough that it's rewarding. The error goes down as a fixed power, which means that it's rewarding to put more and more effort and millions of dollars into learning because you will get noticeably better. So we're looking for models which are defined by their behavior. And so this is important here because I'm dealing with a field of human evolution where there are many informal notions. So again, this is an explanation for people in this room. So the PAC learning model is a model of learning, but the important thing is that it models just generalization. It's clear what it models. But if you say the phrase supervised learning, which is the informal way of describing the phenomenon, then people complain that the human phenomenon of supervised learning is a much longer list of things. Okay, so people on the hear about machine learning, hear that people complain that, well, our systems don't explain what they're doing, they get trapped by spurious correlations. If every positive example had a spot on the top left-hand corner, then the machine may make a mistake that the spot on the top left corner was important. Humans don't make that mistake. So adversarial examples, we had a lecture on the other day, being able to learn lifelong learning without having to retrain. But the point is that informal descriptions aren't adequate because it's just too general. The power of having a formal model is that is the narrowness of it, that you explain exactly what you're modeling and nothing outside the definition is in the concept which you're claiming. So it's a much cleaner, more precise way of discussing phenomena which are maybe have everyday familiarity. Okay, so we're back here, and okay, so the answer I come to about this cognitive capability is something I call educability. So it's a compound concept which includes learning and reasoning and a little more. So as the name suggests, so it's meant to be a technical definition of a combination of things. So I won't define it here, but to get an idea of what it's about. So a prime example of our educability of our species is 300 people coming together in a room and listening to each other. It's about our desire to soak in information and to be able to process it. So it's processing information, but also soaking it in from the outside. And this, I believe, is extremely general and primitive to humans, much less than in the, you don't need the academic world, so people who stand around and look at their cell phones all the time are absorbing information for some reason. People who read fiction, again, are hungrily absorbing information, who knows why. It doesn't benefit them, but everyone is hungry for absorbing information. This is our great characteristic. So the question I'm asking about the capability, the uniquely human ability, which is responsible for our civilization, such as this question became an obvious question after Darwin. And in fact, Darwin did ask the question. And so his answer was that it was difficult to answer. So one comment he makes is that answering it with phrases like consciousness, or phrases where, in his words, no two people agree on what it means. So that's a bad idea. But then the other thing he also says is that, he thinks that humans are different from other animals by degrees, so it's hard to isolate a single trait which is human to us, which is unique to us and really important. And generally, I think, all the people who work in this area in 150 years since have generally agreed that no single, no single easily expressible concept or easily expressible by a single conventional phrase works too well. So what computer science offers here is that because we try to define things mathematically, we can be more precise, we much reduce ambiguity, it's clearer what we mean and what we don't mean. And one advantage of that is that, in fact, we can express concepts which are a bit more complicated, okay? But by being a bit more precise, one can combine 2 or 3 ideas and try to make it into a unified, combined concept and work with that. So I think in this area, what computer science offers is pretty clear. And so I've given it one shot of trying to give an answer to the question. So thank you.
We do have time for questions, if you're happy to take a question or two. Does anyone, that was a very quick hand.
Just some sense of what does educability have that, say, learning did not?
Well, so the primary thing is this inductive learning, which goes back a very long way in evolution. Simply animals can adapt. On top of that, also, I think it's ancient is being able to chain together things you've learned this way, is some sort of reasoning. And then the third main ingredient is being able to accept instruction. So if someone gives you a lecture, you don't have to see the examples or chain together things you've learned by example, but you can use the apparatus you have in your brain to integrate that.
Any other questions from the audience? Can't believe we might actually have 3. Everyone is very surprised by this. Okay, well, lots to think about for sure. Leslie, thank you very much. Our 4th and final speaker of this morning's Spark session is Joseph Sifakis, who was the recipient of the Turing Award in 2007 for work on the development of model checking. I personally always think of Joseph as the laureate with the dog. If any of you have seen his fantastic portrait photo in the HLF website and the book, he has his dog with him in the photograph. And I also discovered that Joseph is a commander of the Greek Order of the Phoenix, which to me is the coolest title that I think has ever existed. Today, he will be talking about Safe AI, a systems engineering perspective. Joseph.
So, good morning. I am not an AI expert. I have worked a lot on critical systems. So in this talk, I will tackle safe AI through my systems engineering lenses. Okay, so to start, let me say that today, the broad use of AI raises a lot of issues regarding its trustworthiness, and trustworthiness is characterized by a broad range of properties, especially safety, and AI safety also has preoccupied authorities in the US, in Europe also. We had numerous consultations, hearings everywhere, and I think that finally they have been unable to draw up a concrete and realistic framework, and I'm not optimistic about that. Now, in addition to AI safety, a great deal of works today in AI aim at building systems that satisfy human-centric properties. As you see here, people talk about responsible AI, AI aligned with human ethical behavior, and people want also to attribute mental attitudes to AI systems. And I think that all these approaches are impossible to be based on a rigorous scientific approach, and that's what I will try to explain. So an important question that I will discuss in this talk is how can AI systems be guaranteed to satisfy given properties in the same way we have done for traditional systems, and what we can learn from traditional systems engineering. So let me start with some clarifications. Today we have two computing paradigms: traditional computers that are programmed, so this is model-based knowledge. We can understand what they are doing. They can be verified. And neural networks that are systems that generate empirical knowledge and by learning. And these are black box systems, hard to understand. And also what I would like to say is that in the AI community used the term model for neural networks, and I think that, okay, I mean, I'm not using the term model in this sense. For me, models are representation of things that we use to explain and understand real things. So for me, neural networks are just artifacts, as software is an artifact, of course. And something else, neural networks do not execute algorithms, of course. We use algorithms to train them. The underlying model is completely different. And I think to better understand the difference between neural networks and computers, there is an interesting analogy between the two systems of thinking of Kahneman. Slow thinking corresponds to traditional computing, and fast thinking to neural computing. Now, let me discuss this concept of explainability, because there is a lot of confusion about that. I will say that the system is explainable if I can extract a model of the system behavior on which I can reason, that I can analyze. And in scientific disciplines, we use mathematical models to do that. And in traditional digital systems, we consider their behavior as a transition system. So I hope this is clear. And now, what it means for me, explainability of neural networks. Neural networks for me are huge combinatorial circuits, so I can imagine that it would be possible to extract some function that relates the inputs to the outputs, this function f here. And theoretically, at least for feed-forward networks, it's possible to compute such a function by propagating, if I know the functions computed by each node, this is well defined, it's the weighted sum of inputs to which I apply an activation function. So theoretically this is possible, but we know that this approach will not scale up for neural networks in real life. There are other definitions of explainability, but in papers, but I don't think that these definitions provide a basis to guarantee properties, what I'm interested in. Now, let me say a few words about how we can guarantee properties of traditional systems. I have worked a lot on that. If you want to guarantee the safety of a system, you have methodologies that are predefined. This is the famous V model that is applied for system development and is recommended also by some standards. I will not get details here. What is important is that you have predefined development steps, and the developer, bottom line, should provide some arguments to justify its choices based on models. And once you do that, also you have to make an analysis when you want to integrate your system in some environment to analyze the causes of risks. I mean, it's a fairly complicated process, but it's based always on models. And based on that, a systems engineer can guarantee the safety. For instance, for an aircraft, you should provide arguments to the certification authority that show that you will not have more than 10 to the minus 9 failures per hour of flight, something like that, okay? Now, something more about the system properties. Any technical requirement can be broken into these three different types of properties. Safety, nothing bad will happen, and you can specify what it means bad. Bad means is a predicate characterized by explicit condition on variables. Security, the system is resilient to attacks, and performance. I think these three kinds of properties are understood. I think that when today people talk about safe AI, they understand safety and security both. Now, what are the possible approaches to validate a system property? Either you apply verification. Verification means that you have a model of your system. You can reason about that. You can explore possible situations. And by doing this, it's possible to verify what I call universally quantified properties. These are safety or security. Any state meets some requirement. And then, for instance, for neural networks, I don't see how I can do that. So the only way to validate properties is by applying testing techniques. And so test methods also are well known. These are methods where we verify properties, but the properties are subject to some observability and controllability constraints. And in particular, properties like safety and security can only be falsified, cannot be guaranteed. Now, let me say a few words about testing. I have applied testing techniques to systems. Testing is an essential part of a scientific method. In any discipline, you apply testing techniques. So what it means to test a system, I have a system S, and I have, so I have a system S, a property that is a relation between inputs and outputs, and an oracle. The oracle is an agent that can be a human or a system that will evaluate the property P, the predicate P, and will give a verdict, pass or fail. Now, in order to, you need to decide practically that whether a property is satisfied, is valid for a system. You need, in fact, a test method that will allow you to generate a finite set of experiments, and based on these experiments, you will reach some conclusion. So for this, in principle, you need two types of functions. A coverage function, so the coverage function gives for a set of input vectors the probability that you explore the states of the system, and the score function. The score function will give for a set of experiments the likelihood that the property is satisfied. So And something that is very important when you try to build a test method is the reproducibility of results. What means reproducibility of results? It means that if I have two different sets of experiments that have the same coverage, then the scores will be the same within some margin that is predicted by the theory. So these basic things about testing, and now let's see whether testing techniques can be applied to AI systems. Here I give an example of systems, so testing applied to physical systems or to flight controllers, and you can see that we have well-defined rigorous approaches, and we can guarantee in the best possible manner what we call conclusive evidence that the properties hold. And then, of course, you can apply statistical testing, for instance, to evaluate the efficiency of a vaccine, okay? And now let's see what we can say about the different types of AI systems. For ChatGPT, I cannot say anything, of course, because even the predicate P is a relationship between questions and answers, cannot be specified formally, so a scientific method is not applicable. Then there are other classes of systems, in particular, so I work on self-driving systems. For this, the properties can be formally specified. We can have a framework to do that, but we need some theory for some test methodology, and we don't have. I mean, and it's a very hard problem how to define coverage criteria for AI systems. So just to summarize, the application of test methods to AI systems is limited to properties that can be rigorously specified and observed. So human-centric properties are excluded. And also, there is a problem with adversarial exams. I don't have time to discuss this, because the presence of adversarial exams jeopardizes the requirement for reproducibility. Just to conclude now, there is today a tendency to ignore all these obvious technical limitations of AI systems. And there are many examples of this. There is a very rich literature. People talk about ethical AI, and this cannot be discussed on technical grounds. Also, what is remarkable is that in the United States, the legislation and regulations allow self-certification. So we don't have standards, and they allow, you know this, they allow self-certification. So this is also a trend that we should take into account. Now, I think to conclude that as societies, we have been able to control the technological risk. So when you buy, say, a toaster, it is guaranteed that if you use it properly, it will not kill you, or you get in an aircraft. Okay, there are some guarantees. So I think we should take the similar approach for AI systems. There is no reason, objective reason, for not to apply, okay? So we should require trustworthiness guarantees, and of course, the rule is that the guarantees you require will depend on the degree of criticality of a system. So if you have a system to play games, of course, okay, it's not critical. Now, I think also in this use of AI systems today, there is a lot of focus on AI systems as conversational systems. But the future of AI, I'm convinced, is not this. The future of AI is monitoring, so making predictions, detection of events, that will be very, very important. And finally, also, end-to-end AI controllers for autonomous systems. This is a big challenge. Okay, so I think for this, we should work to prepare the future. It's obvious for me that we should have restriction on training data sets. So when an LLM explains how to make a bomb, this information is somewhere in the training set. Otherwise, I don't understand. They summarize information they have, okay? Now, I see two important work directions. We need the new foundations. One is to explore avenues for explainability by considering perhaps some types of networks, so by restricting the performance and the structure in the networks, okay, can have ideas about that. And also, another idea is to consider hybrid solutions. I'm working at that. So since von Neumann, we know how to build reliable systems from unreliable components. So one solution would be to have an reliable AI system, end-to-end solution, and then to have some trusted system that runs in parallel. I mean, there are technical solutions, and I'm all for that. So I will stop here. I hope I left some time for questions. Thank you.
We do indeed have time for questions. The laureates today, you've all been very well behaved on the timing, so I appreciate that. So does anyone have a question for Joseph?
When you design a trusted aircraft control system, you don't worry too much about the pilot misbehaving, becoming crazy, and trying to crash the airplane. In the applications of AI, they are going to constantly interact with people, some of which are going to be malicious. How are you going to include the malicious behavior in your analysis, in the framework you described to us, trying to understand?
But why you say that when I design an aircraft, an autopilot for an Airbus, I don't care about crazy behavior of the pilot?
Because
I do care.
Some airplanes
I do care. There are some limitations. So you can apply the same limit. No. The big difference is that the autopilot I use in Airbus is model-based. So I perfectly understand what it will do and how it will react. And also, I can analyze the behavior of the pilot and say, okay, so if the pilot tries to do that, then you react like that. So I have predictability and I perfectly understand what the autopilot does. The problem with an AI system is that I don't understand how it will react, okay? That's the problem. And this is the issue of explainability. If I had a model of an AI system, I would trust it. Now, this is not a reason for not using AI systems in an aircraft. Perhaps you can use AI or in self-driving cars. My idea is to use AI systems in self-driving cars and in parallel to have a trusted anti-collision system or a trusted system that is certified. Now, this solution raises a lot of technical issues because of how to make the transition from the untrusted to the trusted or give back the control. I mean, it's not as simple as it seems. But I think these are solutions that we should try, okay? Because AI systems are extraordinary in solving efficiently some problems, okay, and globally, and we should take advantage of that.
We've got another one over there in the second row.
Thank you for the great talk. I think in the space of AI, it seems that the hardest problem at the moment is just figuring out what properties to define. So I really like your framework, but as we kind of consider these models that just have such a huge range of possible capabilities, what are the advice?
I agree with that, and there are papers, I get really angry when I read these papers, because, I mean, any kind of property you can imagine for a system. I mean, this is something we know from systems engineering, okay? Is either a safety property, which means that the system itself will do something wrong, or a security property, that some threat will come from the environment, okay? Now, and then performance properties. Now, if you say, if people define a property, say my AI system is honest, okay? I mean, in epistemic requirement, an elementary epistemic requirement is if you say that, claim that your system satisfies this property, P, then you should tell me, this is the definition, And not this is the definition, this is the way I validate this property. So if a guy comes and says, I am for responsible AI, I'm not against responsible AI anyway. I am for honest AI, for whatever they want, okay? Bottom line, they should come, and I have not seen any paper like that, okay? Or ethically aligned AI. I mean, it's amazing. Read papers on ethically aligned AI. Alignment is a homomorphism of behaviors. This is the way I understand alignment as a mathematical property, okay? So this means that you can establish a homomorphism between the behavior of the system that you don't understand and human ethical behavior that you don't understand either, okay? So I cannot say anything more. Okay, sorry. Okay.
And I think we can probably just do one more. I think there was somebody there sort of halfway back. Did you have a question? Yeah. Someone's just coming from behind you there with a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your talk. I really like I really like your work, which really kind of like talks about why some people, even from the AI ethics field, we are now suggesting that we must develop more specialized AI systems that do specific things that we can clearly validate. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, so I think this is what my talk was about, that if you want to build systems that meet a property, you should also provide some evidence that the system you build meets this property, okay? This is a minimum you have to do, okay? Yeah.
And then does this then mean that, you know, the idea of building AGI is misplaced?
The idea of building
artificial general intelligence.
But this is different. I mean, artificial general intelligence, nobody understands what it means. I have my definition of what it can mean, but this means in particular that you have systems that are not, if the answer for AGI is that conversational systems we have today, I mean, it's not that. For me, we will have, we will reach artificial general intelligence if we have systems that can replace humans performing tasks. So for me, I would say that if I can build a system that can drive a car, for instance, this is okay, this is some evidence that the systems can be really intelligent, okay? But AGI is something that we will not reach probably, I don't know, okay? So I understand that people are over-optimistic, they play with GPT and dream and say we are close to yes. But ChatGPT cannot drive cars, cannot perform many different tasks that characterize human skills. And human intelligence is, after all, a combination of skills. So it's not enough to have a system that solves efficiently one problem. The key issue with human intelligence is the combination of skills, and for each skill, perhaps machines can do much better, but humans can do much better in combining the skills, understanding, and also choosing goals and acting purposefully, okay? And this is something that characterizes human intelligence and cannot be reached. I mean, today, I mean, it's ridiculous to say that ChatGPT approaches human intelligence. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, yes. A round of applause for Joseph and for all of our speakers this morning. Thank you.